They told him to save himself. They gave him the switch, the blue ribbon with a loop like a noose against his palm, and they promised the sky would take him home. It should have been the easiest order he'd ever followed. The airplane was in pieces around him, a wing half shredded, fuel spraying like a fountain, and the lights of the enemy airfield were a glittering bruise below. Yet, as the canopy cracked and the cold wind tried to drag him out, Major Thomas Tom Halstead reached down, unhooked the harness, and shoved the eject lever back in. How did a pilot refuse the one thing meant to save him, the parachute and the certainty, and instead choose a landing no sane man would attempt? That question sat in the center of every map, every debrief, every ambiguity that followed. It was the thing people argued about in bars and behind closed doors. Cowardice or courage, loyalty or madness. The truth sat on the runway like a burned-out husk, and a single stubborn man who would not let his crew vanish into the dark. October 7th, 1972. Hour, 02:13. Zulu. Grid, N16 to ground 24, E44 to ground 45 checks. A string of numbers that would haunt the survivors for decades. The target was a hardened logistics node on the outskirts of Sanaa, Yemen. A road junction that intelligence said moved supplies into the mountains. The mission was straightforward. 2 F-4 Phantoms from the 47th Tactical Recon Group would do a night low-level ingress, hit the target with precision bombs, and climb out before air defenses woke. They had flown low for 2 hours over a black ocean of rock and farm lights, trusting the radar altimeter, the trust of the man beside them, and the silence of the universe. Tom was the aircraft commander in Phantoms L2, call sign Razor 2. Lieutenant James Jimmy Arnett was his radar intercept officer, the man who watched the screens, plotted the threats, and read the strips of paper on the console. Speed, altitude, heading. Both men were seasoned. Vietnam had a way of making veterans and survivors of equal measure, and both knew the odds as the flak began. The first hit took the starboard stabilizer. It was a sound like a rifle shot in a cathedral. Metal vibrated, lights flickered, and the aircraft yawed. Jimmy cursed into the darkness, fingers dancing over the radio knobs. The primary hydraulic. Cockpit announcements clattered. The jet shuddered again like a wounded animal refusing to go down. Mayday, Mayday, Razor 2. Control, we've taken a hit. Right tail. We're losing trim, Tom said, voice flat. The practiced calm of a man cataloging damage. They had trained for this, briefed for worst-case scenarios. Hit the deck, get out, rendezvous. But training couldn't simulate what came next. A second jag of anti-aircraft fire struck the left wing root. The nose pitched up hard. The altimeter read 200 feet, and the world outside the canopy was a sea of black with the target like a bruise beneath. The right engine fluttered, a cough, a flame. The left engine hung on. Warnings erupted. The radar warning receiver howled with multiple lock tones. The ground was too close. The ejection envelope, the safe altitude and speed for a clean egress, closed like a fist. "We can't eject," Jimmy said. "We're below minimums for both seats. If we go into the mountains. Thermal currents, trees. It's a killing field." He knew the numbers. He'd memorized them like prayers. At that altitude and airspeed, if the rear seat went first, the airflow could pull the pilot into the jet or into the ground. Even if they survived the fall, enemy patrols would likely capture or execute them. Options? Tom's voice sharpened. They banked shallow, trying to keep the damaged tail from folding. The landing gear was down. It had jammed on the last approach after a control input got stuck, the wheel warning sounding like a heartbeat in the cockpit. "There's a strip," Jimmy said, voice pointing at a patch of dim amber light on the map. "4 clicks north, unlit. Coordinates match. Secondary field. Not on the list, but it exists. They used it in '69 during the convoy operations." Tom's jaw worked. He checked the fuel gauges. Fuel was seeping out of a tear near the aft fuselage, a dark wetness staining the panel. The airplane had been designed to survive hits and damage and still be controllable, to return its men home. But designs are theory. Real life folds like paper under fire. "Can we make it?" Tom asked. "It'll be close. If we don't get this under control, the tail will come off. If it comes off." Jimmy didn't finish. They turned toward a strip that, on paper, should have been invisible, 600 meters long of rolled dirt and hard-packed sand. It had no lights, no approach markers, only the outline of a runway like a rib in the darkness. The GPS had seen better days. Navigation was a choreography of compasses and dead reckoning. This, then, was the central question the mission became. Could a damaged F-4 Phantom, with a compromised tail assembly, a wounded engine, and crew below ejection altitude, make an unlit night landing on an improvised desert strip in territory that wanted them dead? The mission shifted from destroying a target to saving the men aboard Razor 2. Each decision widened the danger. Staying aloft to attempt a landing risked a catastrophic failure that would take both men down in a fireball. Ejecting meant scattering them across a hostile landscape likely to be captured or killed. Tom's hand hovered over the eject handle and then moved away. He told himself, and Jimmy, there were other ways to leave an airplane than to be flung into the dark. They came in low and slow, tuned to the length of the runway, the feel of the plane. They were ghosts under the stars. Tom adjusted the flaps by feel. Indicators were dead or unreliable. He used the runway visually, narrowing in, the nose toggling in his peripheral vision. In the back, Jimmy listened to the instruments that still talked and gave Tom turn and trim data that made the airplane fly like a person could hold a breath underwater. The strip appeared as a survival equation. If they hit a quarter of the runway and kept it straight, they might stop. If they touched too early, the sand would create drag and flip them into a wall of rocks. If they touched too fast, the brakes wouldn't have a chance. On approach, a new micro hook. A surprise announced itself. A flare of searchlight swept the horizon. A vehicle passing at a nearby road had set up a light to check the sky. Anti-aircraft gunners awakened. The northern ridge erupted in black muzzle flashes, tracer webs knitting the sky. "Hostiles," Jimmy said. "They're tracking us. We'll have to land under fire." Tom's jaw set. The airplane took hits, but stayed obedient. He felt the left engine coughing and the tail trying to wag like a frightened dog. He felt the wheel touch down twice and lift again, like trying to step on a wet log. The landing was not a single event. It was a string of small choices made under pressure. Adjust trim, lower nose, resist the siren urge to throttle. He kept the nose slightly high to prevent the tail from scraping, and then lowered it to get the wheels down. Brake pressure was intermittent. Hydraulic fluid had been lost. Jimmy worked the manual backup, a crank that strained like a lung. They were a machine and two human hearts. They touched. For a breath, everything seemed possible. The plane kissed the runway for 3 glorious seconds, and then, with a groan like an old warship, the asphalt gave way to packed dirt. The wheels dug, the Phantom shuddered, sparks flew where metal met stones, and the nose dropped. It was a long slide measured by hearts and seconds, not meters. The world in the cockpit condensed to the dashboard, the tiny circle of light from Jimmy's map, the dark horizon. Outside, tracer rounds stitched through the air. They were on the ground. They were not out of danger. And then the final unavoidable answer. 14 meters from the runway's end, the engines flamed out as they ran through a pocket of sand and dust. The airframe struck an unseen berm. Metal screamed, the plane slewed, the tail, already compromised, tore free like a bad tooth. The Phantom sheared, separated. Bodies were thrown and restrained by harness and heavy seats. All that held them to life was a series of straps and the way the fuselage folded around them. When it stopped, it was as if time had snapped shut. The air was thick with dust and the smell of burning. For a moment, they listened to silence. Then the field erupted with sound. Angry voices, rifle fire, men running with flashlights. "Stay strapped. Don't move until we know where they're coming from," Tom said, his voice close to a whisper and hard as flint. He unbuckled methodically, checked Jimmy, who was bloody across the face but conscious. He climbed out because pilots always run forward into danger for reasons older than training. They moved as a unit, crawled to the wing and ducked low, listening for engines. Enemy soldiers were shouting in Arabic, and the footsteps were close, too close. The landing had been plenty for the enemy to see. Halstead and Arnett had crashed inside hostile territory, in the belly of the map's biggest question. How did he get both of them down alive? Word of the crash didn't sit still. The other Phantom, Razor 1, turned and circled. It radioed back that it had lost contact with Razor 2 and then that it saw the crash. "We're coming back in," the other pilot said, voice tight. But the other plane had its own problems. Smoke in its cockpit and rounds in its bulkheads. And then the second aircraft had to leave. It became a question of minutes. Could they be on the ground before ground forces closed in? In those minutes, the story of Tom's refusal to eject began to harden into myth. The first micro-decision that made this whole scene possible was not heroism. It was calculation. Eject at low altitude, and you let the environment, the mountains, the desert, the enemy patrols, render the odds worse than surgical. Stay with the airplane, and you might turn an ejection into a controlled landing, but the chance of catastrophic structural failure increased with every second. This was the calculus Tom had run in a heartbeat, the lives of two men versus the uncertain mercy of the desert. The immediate reaction outside the cockpit was split. Within hours, there were phrases that would define the men involved. Reckless, self-sacrificing, insane, saved his navigator. Debrief reports filled pages with technical data. Required landing speed, engine output, structural failure thresholds, altitudes, and ejection envelopes. The simplest answer: Tom refused to eject because he wouldn't let his RIO die alone, was the most human. But it was also too neat for people who liked rules and boxes. There were other things at play: the weight of training, the culture of command, and an intimacy with the aircraft itself that made pilots see the jet as an extension of their bodies. You don't just abandon a thing that keeps your mates alive. That night in the desert, they were pinned behind a wing while the enemy tried to burn them out. There was no cavalry in those first hours, only darkness and the noise of men looking for trophies. Tom and Jimmy were lucky to have communication with Razor 1 long enough for it to relay coordinates. They were luckier still that the strip they had picked lay near a U.S. SIGINT station, a listening post that monitored enemy broadcasts. Within 90 minutes, a rescue chain swung into motion. Helicopters, a predator of the era's reconnaissance, but not the modern drone, rather an RF surveillance plane, and a combat rescue team not out of a storybook, but of blood, grit, and bureaucratic friction. What happens next is the story everyone wants in neat arcs. The daring nighttime rescue, a helicopter lifting men out under heavy fire, the handshakes in the medical tent. But reality is messier. The rescue of Razor 2 became a collision of politics, inter-service rivalry, and the cruel arithmetic of risk. The Air Force controllers wanted to wait for daylight, to call in close air support, to use the cover of B-52s circling at high altitude. The theater commander wanted the men back now to prevent propaganda and to keep sensitive technology out of enemy hands. The CIA wanted the runway secured to prevent any forensic recovery. The Army had troops, but not the airframes. In the middle of it was a pilot who had not ejected and who, for reasons of his own, had chosen to land rather than jump. As the minutes turned into hours, the microhooks kept arriving. A night vision optical system failed on the rescue bird. A squadron commander argued that the risk of losing multiple helicopters to anti-aircraft fire was unacceptable. The enemy set up blocking positions on nearby roads, baiting the rescue forces. A thunderhead moved in from the west, spitting rain that made the dust into clutching mud, which would make helicopter landings much harder at dawn. Through it all, Halstead refused to give a public explanation. He answered questions with a glance and a skeletal sentence which fueled the rumor mill. In private, he told his RIO that the decision was straightforward. We were in the jet. I still had the airplane between us and the ground. I wasn't going to let that become their method of collecting us. That capsule confession was the emotional core. The pilot who refused to eject didn't do it to be a hero. He did it because he felt like the plane gave them a better chance than scattered parachutes would. That logic looked almost mathematical when you laid the variables out. Chance of enemy capture upon landing on a hostile runway with a damaged jet versus chance of survival in the mountains with 2 parachutes. The stubbornness was tactical, not theatrical. But metrics and heart don't translate well into the military reports that decide careers. The investigators wanted to know if Halstead had violated protocol by not ejecting. They wanted to know if his choice endangered the mission and whether it had led to the enemy gaining intelligence on the Phantom's damage, on its systems, on its vulnerabilities. There were whispers that the plane had been fitted with a classified ECM suite. The enemy's understanding of its interior damage would be invaluable. The field report reads like a drumbeat that covers the human details with a sheen. Engine failure at 0209, hydraulic pressure loss, runway available at +4 minutes, touchdown at +9 minutes, evacuation at +123, enemy approaching at +120. But the human story shows the small, critical choices that don't make it into the ledger. The manual trim that Jimmy cranked with burning hands, Tom sliding the canopy latch with a piece of the flap dug into his glove, how they turned off the gyros to keep the instruments from misinforming them, the smell of burning insulation that made them think of their wives and homes and the things worth dying for. Night turned into dawn, and with it a new round of complications. The rescue helicopters probed, hovering above the strip as snipers fired from ridge lines. The first bird took fire and returned, wounded but intact. The pilots who flew second and third into the kill zone were men who had seen worse and compensated for fear with ritual, pre-flight checks, prayer, and a reckoning with odds that read like simple math. They chose to accept the chance rather than let the enemy close on the airplane and its secrets. When the rescue finally landed, it did so under a sky scrubbed by sunrise and a battlefield of spent ammunition and scorched earth. The men of the rescue team ran with purpose, tossed smoke grenades, and pulled the survivors. Tom moved through the motion like someone half fatigued and half relieved. Jimmy's face was bruised, his left arm splinted with field tape. They were peeled out of their harnesses and into the arms of flight medics who smelled like coffee and antiseptic. Back at the base, there were ceremonies, cameras, and claims. Tom and Jimmy were celebrated, decorated, and in private, judged. The higher-ups praised the skillful landing under impossible conditions, while simultaneously scolding the deviation from egress protocol. The pilots' union argued that no man should be forced to eject into certain death. The policymakers countered that adherence to procedure saved lives in the long run. But the most important scene took place in a dingy debrief room with a blown fluorescent light at 10 Dakar on October 8th, in which the central mystery was teased, sliced, and carefully answered. Investigators sat with maps, photos of the wreckage, and transcripts of radio chatter. An engineer had stripped the remains of Razor 2's tail and found metal deformations that told a story of overstrain that matched Tom's claim. The tail would have failed catastrophically within 2 minutes had they remained in the air. The ejection sequence was reconstructed with simulations, and it showed that had they ejected on approach into the desert's rocky canyons, neither would likely have walked away. And this is where the sentimentality of heroics meets the cold calculus of risk. The final answer formed like a mirror held up to the face of every officer. Halstead's refusal to eject was not a fluke or a romantic gesture. It was, given the circumstances as they were, the statistically safer option. He chose to accept the plane's death to preserve his crew's chance of life. That truth stripped the romance of the story, but deepened its moral gravity. He traded the certainty of a violent individual escape for the slim possibility of a collective survival. What followed was a legal and emotional tangle. Tom's refusal to follow ejection protocol became the subject of multiple hearings. Some called for his reprimand. Others argued for a medal. Families of pilots who had ejected in similar circumstances filed Damocles letters. The debate revealed fault lines within an institution built on following orders. When does initiative become insubordination, and who gets to decide in the interspace between survival and doctrine? There were also quieter consequences. Jimmy lost partial hearing in one ear from the concussive forces of the crash. He no longer loved the sound of airplane engines the way he once had. Tom walked away, but with a different kind of weight. He was lauded as a hero in some rooms and castigated in others, and that ambivalence ate at him. He replayed every decision like a film he couldn't pause. If he had moved the nose earlier, would the tail have held? If he had told Jimmy to eject before the second hit, would they both now be in hiding or graves? All of these were speculative tremors that had no single answer. There was, too, the practical aftermath that no public relations office wanted aired. The enemy took the parts of Razor 2 they could salvage to analyze. The classified ECM pod was smashed and partly melted, but engineers found traces that suggested the adversary gained insight into early 1970s noise-jamming capabilities. There were losses of equipment that mattered, but did those losses outweigh the lives saved? Depending who you asked, the balance tipped differently. In the months that followed, new training manuals were written to address the gray areas Tom's choice exposed. The Air Force changed ejection guidance for low-altitude profiles. It also tightened rescue protocols to reduce the time that downed aircrews had to wait in hostile territory. Tom's landing became a case study discussed at squadrons, not as a simple model of what to do, but as an example of the calculus of command. The emotional payoff, the final blunt answer the story owed its listeners, comes down to this. He refused to eject because, for him, the plane offered the one remaining viable avenue to keep his crew together. The choice was not a gallant preference for martyrdom, but a tactical maximization of survival probability for both men. He weighed the variables in a heartbeat and opted for a path that few protocols could anticipate. There is a further, quieter truth, though, that lingers. War is a place where the lines between procedure and improvisation blur, because the enemy rewrites the rules as fast as we learn them. The pilot who refused to eject was both product and parable. A man trained to follow orders who discovered the orders did not always reflect the reality of a burning metal tube and the desert below. His refusal was not defiance for its own sake. It was the sort of grim pragmatism of people who have to make life and death decisions in less time than a heartbeat. In the final tally, both men lived, but the cost was not just physical. The psychological ledger recorded losses in the spaces between words. Tom would wake at night, awake to the smell of burnt insulation and the flash of tracer lines. He would see the runway as if it extended into forever, each meter a calculus of survival. He would never accept that being saved absolved him from the consequences of choices made in the white heat of crisis. Jimmy would sometimes wake with a start, listening for the sound of manual trim cranking in his head, the ghost movement of his hand in the cramped cockpit. They both lived to tell the tale and to receive the bitter light of scrutiny. The public narrative made them heroes. The private narrative kept the dust. That dust was part of the scar left by the night. Not only a scar on a plane someone's engineers had to catalog, but a scar on their souls. In the last months of his career, Tom sat in a little office with a wall of commendations and a photograph of a beaten phantom on a rutted runway. He would look at the photograph and sometimes laugh, sometimes shake his head. He told a reporter once simply, "I didn't refuse to eject because I was brave. I refused because either we both went or one went and the other didn't. I chose the one that let us both try." And that is the blunt resolution. Tom's refusal was the answer to the central question because it was the only choice that fit the reality under fire. It was a human decision made in a human body, imperfect and necessary. The airplane was not a symbol, but a tool. The decision was not a vanity, but a calculation. The plane went down. The men came home. The enemy salvaged metal. Policies were rewritten. Lives were changed. You can argue forever about doctrine. You can rehearse the permutations of what if. But the last image is simple and terrible. A runway stretching into dawn, a man leaning on the shattered fuselage, smoke trailing like a thin apology into the pale sky, and the knowledge that sometimes refusal is the truest form of command. The lesson of that night is not that rules are wrong or right, but that decisions are made by people inside the machines, and in the split seconds when life and death flirt, the man who will not jump stays, because the plane, for a few more breaths, is all the mercy he can offer another human being. The photograph in Tom's office never told the whole story. It froze a single triumphant frame, smoke, bent wing, men in fatigues embracing, but it couldn't show the hours before the salvage crews arrived, when Tom sat alone with the plane's skeleton and listened to the desert wind pick at loose wires. He remembers fingering a jagged edge of aluminum and thinking of the two lives that had hinged on his hands. There were no manuals for that moment. There was only the animal clarity that comes when the engine of consequences begins to wind down, the smell of burnt wiring, the taste of dust, the metallic ring in his ears. The salvage crews came with heavy bags and clipboards and a sense that their work might not be romantic, but would be thorough. An ordnance tech photographed the remains of the ECM pod through a gloved hand and shook his head. The aluminum artery that supplied fuel had been pierced, but the main fuel cell had not been torn open, a detail that made the investigators nod. Each technical detail became a shard in the larger mosaic. Pressure readings, rivet patterns, the twist of a servo cable. They all seemed to agree on the fundamentals. The plane had been hit, the structure compromised, and the odds of its surviving much more time in flight were small. But understanding the machine could not soothe the human argument. Tom's commanding officer sat across from him in a conference room, the kind soldiers build to make hard things look tidy. There were official forms on the table and a small flag pin that seemed less important than Tom's hands, which had not stopped trembling since he had slid out of the wreckage. His CO did not shout. He spoke in even sentences and asked even questions. "Why didn't you eject, Major?" he asked like a man reading policy. Tom could have answered with doctrine, ejection protocol, minimum altitude charts, the table of probabilities. He could have recited probabilities like scripture and sent the matter to the numbers. Instead, he said, "We were in it together. It was still the better option. I thought if I leave him, he's going to be on the ground in worse shape and alone. If we both stay, we at least have a chance together. I didn't want to divide us." The words landed like an admission and an indictment. The commander could have nodded and accepted. Instead, he leaned forward and said quietly, "You know the policy, Halstead. You should have followed egress. You could have saved yourself no matter what." Tom recognized the line as one he had heard before, in classrooms, in briefings. People who were not in the cockpit could not feel the plane chewing at its own guts. They could not hear the mismatched harmonics of the metal as a tail studiously unstitched itself from the fuselage. Doctrine existed because it worked the majority of the time. It could not and would not cover every freaked angle of combat. The hearing that followed was procedural and meticulous, and for Tom, an emotional gauntlet. Witnesses were called, radar techs, maintenance crews, Razor One's pilot, the Rescue Bird's pilots. The tone was sometimes sympathetic, often clinical. The tapes captured words that were later replayed for committees and families and press. We were below ejection altitude, hydraulics lost, tail structure compromised. It was, in the end, less about guilt and more about precedent. If one man could choose to buck procedure, others might follow. The institution was afraid of the precedent, but the thing about precedent is that it is made of people and circumstances, and not all of them fit into neat boxes. Halstead had made an extemporaneous calculation under a particular set of variables. It was easy to cite policy. It was harder to rule against a man who had saved a life. The panel split. Some argued that his actions represented an unacceptable risk to air doctrine. Others argued that policy should be flexible when it came to the lives of those actually in the system, because manuals cannot account for the myriad ways things can go wrong over enemy territory at 00200. When the final decision came down, it was a compromise. Halstead received a formal reprimand for deviation from egress procedures, a mark that would shadow promotions and social debates, and he was given an Air Medal for extraordinary achievement in aerial flight, a paradox neatly wrapped in bureaucratic language. Terminology like extraordinary achievement and reprimand existed on the same paper, because institutions, like humans, are ambivalent about unsanctioned heroism. Months later, sitting with cups of scalding coffee and a cigarette he no longer inhaled, Tom told Jimmy the worst part wasn't the reprimand. It was the idea that someone else, a passerby unscarred by the ordeal, could stand in judgment and speak as if they'd been there. "I don't begrudge the policy," Tom said, "but they shouldn't pretend it is all-knowing." Jimmy, who slept fitfully and hummed to himself to keep the tinnitus from taking him apart, chewed on his lip. "We did what we had to do," he said. "All this other noise doesn't change that we came out together." Their friendship changed after that. It tightened like a rope and frayed in different places. They were bound by something that mattered more than ceremonies or reprimands, an unspoken understanding of what survival in war demanded. That bond would carry them through the courts of opinion and the isolated nights afterward. But how does a single decision made in a cockpit at 0213 ripple out to affect doctrine, morale, and the enemy's hands? The answer is in the slow bureaucratic echo that extends from a downed aircraft to procurement meetings and training syllabi. The engineers tasked with redesigning the Phantom's ejection sequencing ran simulations that took Halstead's case into account. They adjusted timers and improved low-altitude escape hatches where possible. The rescue community analyzed the time-to-rescue curves and argued for faster tasking procedures and better prepositioning of assets, so that no man would have to stay on a broken plane for so long. On the enemy side, technicians took panels from the wreckage back to workshops, pried apart circuits, and studied scorched potting and melted wiring. Their engineers published no papers. They simply incorporated what they'd learned into the small improvements that years later would show up in opposing tactics. In a way, Razor II's wreck became part of the conversation of war, evidence like a bone fragment that other minds would examine and then use. The philosophical argument, whether Tom was right or wrong, had practical consequences beyond medals and reprimands. Training programs began to emphasize not just rules, but the reasoning behind them. Pilots were taught to think in variables and odds and to communicate their calculation to their teams when possible. Rescue crews began to practice more nighttime extractions under fire. Logistics officers tried to make contingency fields less improvised and more reliable. None of these changes erased the memory of the night, but they were small stitches to mend an already complicated fabric. Yet the emotional residue of that evening, the part that lingers like a grain of sand in a sleeping eye, did not reconcile as easily. Tom sometimes woke in the middle of the night and replayed a single second, the warning light that blinked and died, and the way Jimmy had looked at him and said, simply, "We can't eject." It wasn't a decision so much as an agreement, that little moment. The compact of two men in a dying machine was the true place where the choice had been made. Policy books would never capture it. Time softened certain edges. The reprimand, though it cost him options, didn't ruin Tom's life. He continued to fly, less recklessly perhaps, and more haunted by what he'd done. Jimmy left active service and worked in a civilian avionics firm. But the two men met sometimes at reunions, at pubs, at memorials. They told the story in different ways, the way survivors do. Tom described the weight of responsibility and the grind of guilt. Jimmy described the feel of the manual trim handle and the way Tom had kept the plane, even when it wanted to fall apart. Together, their testimony became less about absolutes and more about context. Not everyone who heard the story agreed. Families of other pilots who had perished after following protocol argued bitterly that Halstead's action set a dangerous example. They brought up episodes where following manual could have altered outcomes. They wanted clear rules that could be followed without ambiguity. They loved the idea that orders were immutable because that made the world seem less random. Yet life in a cockpit refuses to become tidy. The desert night had taught all of them something heavier. Rules are for training. Real choices happen inside a glass bubble of instrument light and smoke. The final administrative memory of Razor 2 came when the plane's carcass was finally hauled away in sections and burned parts were cataloged. The National Archives received reports and photographs. A young historian, years after the event, would later sit with the declassified files and write a paper that cut through some of the moral fog. He argued that Halstead's choice, while irregular, should be judged by the outcome and the calculated likelihoods. The paper was dry and well-referenced, and it softened the edge of the public debate, but it couldn't fix the small losses. Jimmy's hearing, Tom's nights, the damaged parts the enemy took, the unspoken reprimand that lingered in the hallways of the squadron. What made the story stick, beyond the drama and the bureaucracy, was the image that returned to men in various ages. A pilot refusing to yield his conscience to a lever, choosing instead to tether himself to a failing machine like a guardian. Men saw in that decision an old code of duty, not duty to an order, but duty to the man beside you. That code resonates because it is older than policy. It is older than aviation, older even than modern militaries. It is the tribal thing people do with their lives when they're asked to be more than themselves for someone else. In the end, the plain answer to the central question is a human one. Tom refused to eject because he judged that staying with the aircraft offered the best chance to keep both him and Jimmy alive. He made that judgment from inside a cramped metal coffin, where the noise of failure is so total it becomes a kind of voice. There is no cleaner moral slice. There is only the fact that a man chose to stay. that doesn't mean the choice was without cost. The enemy gained something from the wreckage. Doctrine needed modification. Tom's career bore a mark. But both men left the desert alive, and for them that mattered more than any policy debate. Years later, at the memorial for aircrews lost in that theater, Tom stood with a small group and watched a line of phantoms thunder overhead. He thought of the men who hadn't been so lucky, of the crews who had to bail into the mountains. He felt the old tug at the edges of his heart and knew that no single narrative could hold all the answers. He summed it up once, blunt and honest, when a midshipman asked him at a conference, "Is there a lesson?" Tom looked at the boy as if the boy were a mirror to his younger self and said simply, "The lesson is don't make rules more important than people. Doctrine is a tool, not a god."